Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on world events. I'm joined as I am every week by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel, but who's on vacation right now. Richard, welcome back.
Great to be here with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, me too. I thought we would discuss some of the giants in the libertarian movement, that is, people who have influenced you and me, and I think it's safe to say most libertarians. And I'd like for us to assume that this program is being, I know we have a lot of longtime libertarians who watch the show, but I want us to, this week or whenever we profile some of these libertarian giants, to think in terms of somebody watching this program for the first time, doesn't know anything about libertarianism, and sort of serving as an explanation as to why these particular figures serve as such giants in the history of the libertarian movement. And so I thought we would start out with the giant that's near and dear to your heart and my heart, and that's Ludwig von Mises, who I consider, and who many of us consider, the greatest economist who's ever lived. And certainly you qualify in this area. You've studied Mises's ideas and philosophy and his life for so many years. You were the Ludwig von Mises Professor of Economics at Hillsdale College. So why don't you go first and explain to us why it is that so many libertarians put Mises right there in the top 5 or so of giants in the libertarian movement?
Well, to begin with, one can understand that Mises's contribution to economic ideas, both theory and policy, in the 20th century was as a direct and frontal challenge to the collectivist trends of that time, and which still continue today. He challenged the socialists at the most fundamental level. He challenged the advocates of government intervention, redistribution, and regulation of the domestic economy. He challenged those who became the Keynesians, that is, those who believed that government should actively involve themselves in manipulating government fiscal policy, managing the monetary system to try to influence the economy. He challenged all of those assumptions from a radically free market perspective. So before I discuss in a bit of detail each of these challenges he made in defense of free markets against these various forms of collectivist systems, let me at least give, however thumbnail, a little biography of him. He was born in September 1881 in the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. He studied at the University of Vienna, graduating near the turn of the century, around 1906, with his doctor in jurisprudence from the University of Vienna. In those old days, if you wanted to study economics as an advanced subject, you did it through the School of Law, the law faculty. So besides being a professional economist, he was actually a trained lawyer. He lived in this time that was momentous for the transformative events that still affect our lives. He knew the world before the First World War. That is a world that was still predominantly and relatively free market, if not completely laissez-faire, limited government, low taxes, few restrictions on the free movement of goods and men across borders. He then served in the Austrian army during the First World War. He saw the consequences, the cruelty, the destruction that war can bring in its wake. And then he lived in that terrible period of the 1920s and 30s in the Europe of his time in Austria, experiencing the rise of radical socialism and communism, the emergence of fascism in Italy and Nazism in neighboring Germany that finally enveloped his own native country of Austria when Hitler invaded Austria and annexed it. And then he lived in the United States for all of the post-World War II period, experiencing the rise of Keynesian economics and the belief that government has to micromanage and macromanage the economic affairs of a society. And he basically, almost from a beginning point in his early or mid-20s, took a frontal challenge of all of these ideas. His first book his major book was called The Theory of Money and Credit. And what he did basically in that book was to ask a variety of questions. But for our purposes here, he asked the question, what causes business cycles? The booms and busts of inflations and depressions and recessions, are they inherent in the market? Are they endemic to the capitalist system? Are they inescapable burdens of euphoric betterment and then crashing unemployment and falling production that follows with the collapse of the boom? And his conclusion was in this book, was in fact, there is nothing inherent in the market economy or the working of the financial and banking sectors of the economy in themselves that need generate these booms and busts and inflations and recessions. If they do occur, their origin, their basis, their cause is in the mismanagement of monetary and banking matters by what had been set up by governments as central banks. That is, monopoly authorities over the control and the issuance of money in those nation-state economies as a whole, and through that influencing interest rates that influence the pattern of savings and investment in the country. And he basically said is that when a central bank, such as in our country, the Federal Reserve, expands the money supply, they inject it into the banking system. The banks find themselves with extra money to lend. How do you attract more borrowers? You lower the price of the product you're trying to sell more of. Banks lower interest rates. That stimulates more borrowing. But all of this additional borrowing is not out of real savings in the economy, but is based upon just money that's been created out of thin air. And to make a very somewhat long story short, this distortion of interest rates and this artificial stimulus of investment gets investment spending out of whack with savings and consumption spendings by income earners. So you're generating this huge economy-wide imbalance on how resources are allocated, how capital investment is undertaken, how labor is used across the economy, all of which is setting up a house of cards that once the monetary expansion slows down or ceases, brings the house of cards down. So that, in fact, the cause of the recession, the depression, the rising unemployment, the fall of production and output has its seeds, its cause in the preceding boom. And the boom is fed only by this monetary mischief by central banks. Now, while he wrote this in the years before the First World War, and then elaborated upon them in the 1920s and into the 1930s, they in fact represent the core challenge of the approach developed in the 1930s by John Maynard Keynes, the father of Keynesian economics. He argued that capitalism was inherently unstable, that businessmen are erratic and indecisive in their investment decisions. I'm optimistic, I'm pessimistic. He said economies could get stuck in unemployment and low output for long periods of time, that this was endemic to this, and only wise government pulling the fiscal dial and turning the monetary handle could assure balanced order, stability in the economy, in guiding it to full employment. What Mises' approach shows that rather than a cure for depressions, the Keynesian approach and all similar ones are in fact the cause of creating the artificial euphoric boom conditions that have to lead to the very depression that the Keynesians lament and blame on capitalism rather than the mechanisms of the government itself. If one understands this in this way, one understands that this idea of stimulating the economy through fiscal manipulations, quantitative easing through central banks to try to pump up the economy are all artificial and distortive means that may have short-run appearances. Oh, people are back to work, profits seem to be brought back into existence, is really setting up the system for an inevitable downturn in the future that will just bring the hard times back. What then is the best policy, Mises concluded? Well, don't undertake monetary mischief. One is, if there's going to be a government-managed system, at least anchor it in the gold standard, where gold and the production of gold limits how much money can come into the banking system, even through the hands of the government. But the ideal system, right, the free market ideal, the classical liberal ideal, would be the separation of money from the state. That is a private competitive banking system, not open to the control, manipulation, or influence of the political forces of politicians or the central bankers who they appoint. Now, this view is radically different, and in fact challenges, as I was saying, the entire trend and approach of virtually all of macroeconomics that has existed now for 3/4 of a century. That is over 80 years, really, since the rise of Keynesian economics in the 1930s. The second element in his contributions, and I would say that this one, it has been internationally been recognized more, and is in a sense earth-shattering in one level, given the trends of collectivism in the 20th century, was that in 1920 he published an article which has somewhat of an innocuous title, Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, which he then expanded into a book 2 years later in 1922 that in its English translation also has a very rather unoffensive title, Socialism, an economic and sociological analysis. But what he does in that article in this book is to challenge the very capacity of the existence of socialism and socialist central planning. You see, throughout the 19th century, the socialists had argued that capitalism was the source of exploitation, inequality, injustice. Let's overthrow the capitalist system. Let's all own everything together in the collective hands of the people, and let we, the people, centrally plan the economic affairs of the society. So what gets produced is for the people rather than for the profits of a few. And that is, in fact, what first emerged with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in November of 1917, which is just approaching its 100th anniversary of the communist revolution in Russia. Now, facing this, Mises comes out with this article. And in a nutshell, he says this, Jacob. Okay, Mr. Socialist, you've nationalized the means of production. You're in charge, right? The vanguard of the revolution and the central planning agency that you've set up, you're responsible to manage the economy, what gets produced, how it gets produced, for whom it gets produced, and so on. Now, I'm going to make certain assumptions, Mr. Socialist. I'm going to assume that you're a nice guy. I'm not assuming any malevolent or cruel or dictatorial motives on your part. I'm going to assume that your only interest is the interest in the improvement of the conditions of your fellow man. And I'm going to make another assumption, Mr. Socialist. Unlike the anti-socialists of the 19th century, I'm not going to make the assumption like they did that socialism destroys the link between work and reward, since everything that gets produced under socialism is put into a common pot and then ladled out to everyone in equal shares. And I'm not going to say that that's going to create disincentives for people to want to work, because there's no incentive to work more if you don't feel as if you might, all things considered, get more as the reward that you would reap from your efforts. I'm going to assume that everybody's going to be as productive and hardworking and dedicated to the socialist success as under capitalism, where everybody is industrious. Okay, so you're a good guy, and everybody's going to try to work as hard as they did under capitalism, if not even more. I have a very simple question for you, Mr. Socialist. How will you know what to do now that you hold the reins of the economic system? How will you know what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, with what resources to produce, and how it will be distributed to the people? And what Mises then went on to say is to say, let's remember how these decisions are made under a capitalist system. We have private ownership of the means of production. In the market economy, people are allowed to own things, use things, or trade things. When people can trade things, they have to decide what they value more highly and what they value less highly. And in this process, they come together and prices are formed, reflecting the willingness of a buyer to pay and the willingness of a supplier to sell. Now, these market prices that emerge are important. Well, they're important for a number of reasons, but one of them, it serves, as Mises says, as a method of economic calculation. That is, Prices for consumer goods helps businessmen, entrepreneurs, enterprises know what is it that consumers want and the relative values they place upon them. And then there's another market, Mises says, and that's for the means of production, land, labor, and capital. And businessmen are competing against each other, sometimes in offering a similar product to consumers, but then alternative products. One makes automobiles, other person grows food, another person makes eyeglasses, another person makes iPhones, and all of these enterprises and businessmen are competing against each other for the use of the scarce resources of the society. And in that competition, they make bids. Don't work for Joe, work for me. I'll pay you $1.50 more an hour. Don't make a machine that I need in my that's needed in a factory over there for Sam. Make a machine that I need, a capital good that I need to make my product in my sector of the economy. And competing entrepreneurs compete for labor, land, resources, capital equipment, and prices form for the factors of production. This tells businessmen what resources would cost and the relative cost of using them in different ways. And it guides them into deciding what's profitable and not profitable, and the relative cost of doing it in different ways. Now, these prices then guide the entire system. The prices for consumer goods, the things that you and I want to buy every day, that tells the businessman what he would get if he made something and sold it. And the resources for the factors of production, the prices for the factors of production in competition with all of his other businessmen rivals, is telling him, well, what would it cost to produce this good? Would this be a profit or would this be a loss? And if it could be a profit, which combination of the resources to make the product would minimize my expenses to try to maximize my profit? These prices are the steering mechanism, the guiding mechanism. Mises referred to it as the compass that guides the economy, like the compass that is used to guide you traveling across the seas, or a sextant at night using the stars. Without these prices, there is no economic rationality. He said there's planned chaos. You don't know what to produce, how to produce, to minimize the cost, and how to wisely use the resources at your disposal. All you will generate are mismatches between what consumers need and what the central planners decide to produce. Everything will cost more because there's no indicator of what's a cost less and a cost more. And therefore the system will stagnate in waste, misdirection, mismatching, and if we then add on what the anti-socialists argued in the 19th century, a lack of incentives to be as industrious, you'll end up with stagnation, and you can never be sure that the guy on the top managing the socialist system will be a good guy rather than a bad. Therefore, Mises argued that what socialism would lead to in practice would be not a horn of plenty for mankind, but as he entitled a small book of his that he wrote shortly after the Second World War, it will lead to planned chaos. Now, I'll just add one more element to this, and that is Mises's criticisms of the interventionist state. Now, a lot of people have said, of course, socialism, first of all, it's been very brutal, it's been dictatorial, people have suffered under communist regimes without civil liberties or respect for their individual freedom. Of course, who would want that type of, Hitler or Stalin or Chairman Mao communism? But surely a totally free market, a laissez-faire market, isn't that the other extreme? Don't we need something in the middle where the government sort of intervenes and regulates and assures fairness and justice? Mises's response to this is that, in fact, there is no third way. At the end of the day, the choice basically is a free market versus a collectivist planned society. Because the types of interventions and regulations and controls that the interventionists, the regulators propose, in fact, are sand in the machine. The classic example of price controls. Prices tell us what people want, what people are willing to supply it for, and movements of prices bring the two sides of the market into balance, so that what consumers want are just produced and offered in the quantities that producers find it attractive and willing to supply it at. Now, if you set the price too low, you create a shortage. More people want it than suppliers are willing to produce and sell it. If you set the price too high, then you create a surplus. There's more being produced wastefully than consumers think it's worth buying at that fixed price. All of you do is bring about these mismessages and distortions and misuses of scarce resources that could be applied in more rational ways in different parts of the society. A classic example today is this appeal of minimum wage laws. That's a price control. You're telling people under compulsion of law the lowest price that you can hire a worker at for an hourly wage. Well, all this does is result in unemployment. There's a surplus of labor because at that government mandated wage, there may very well be a lot of businessmen who'd say, well, this guy would be worth hiring. But all things considered, his value added to my business would be $10 an hour. I might even be willing to pay $10 an hour. But when the government says I have to pay him $12.50 or $15 an hour, now it's going to cost me more to hire him than he's contributing for me to operate my business. Well, good luck. If you've been working for me, I'm going to have to let you go. And if I was thinking of adding people to my firm, I'm not going to do so. Now, a lot of people argue that this is, why can't the businesses just pay it? Well, the point is that the businessman has no money to pay his costs, including for labor, than the price he expects to earn from consumers by selling a product. And if he tries to jack up his price to cover higher government-imposed costs, then you're going to find that as the price goes up, some consumers are going to start saying, I want that product, and that's an attractive product. But given my budget and other things I could spend my money on, you're now asking too much. I'm not going to buy it, or I'm going to buy less than I did in the past. That's what guides the businessman. He can't pay more than what the market is dictating. If you try to impose it, you just throw people out of their jobs and create unemployment. When you do it with products, it's unsold inventory on the store shelf. Now that is the logic of this. So Mises' argument is that the market needs to guide the activities of the society because they are the great coordinating mechanism that brings everybody together and assures this magnificent order without government planning or design that now envelops the world. Now, if you think of these three ideas, his argument that governments cause inflations and depressions, not the market, that socialism is inherently unworkable as an economic system and will lead to stagnation, mismanagement, waste, and poverty for people, and that if you try to tamper with the market, you run the risk of creating these imbalances and distortions that throw things out of whack that are like sand in the machine. If you combine these three arguments together, you realize that there's only one economic systemic alternative, and that is an unregulated, free enterprise, free market capitalist system where government undertakes only a few narrow functions, and that is protection of each of ours, life, liberty, and honestly acquired property, and the enforcement of contracts and arrangements that we have voluntarily entered into in the marketplace. That is the radical case against these forms of collectivism and mismanagement by government in relation to the case for a true laissez-faire classical liberal free market society. That in its core, the systemic way Mises develops it, and I'm not doing justice to it, the way he argues it, to show how he shows the concepts and the logic that follows from the commonsensical principles of how people choose and act and decide and interact with each other for mutual benefit is a profound vision of the nature of society and how it can be both free and prosperous when the government gets out of the way.
Yeah, when I was in college, I was an economics major, and I learned the standard stuff that they teach in economics. The little model building, the supply and demand curves, and the model for the firm and the model for the society. And I remember thinking while I was taking these economics classes, I guess this is what you do in real life. You go out and you get into the mainstream of life and you see a store that's selling goods and services, and so you get a little chart and a graph and you see what his demand curve is and what his supply curve is, and it's all nonsense, Richard. I mean, once I discovered Mises and Austrian economics, I realized that this is not real life. It has no relationship to real life. That real life is just human beings that are interacting with each other. Right. And that's the distinguishing characteristic for me of Ludwig von Mises, and the title of his famous book was Human Action. And so he analyzes a market economy, but a genuine market economy. That's what's so attracted to me to Mises, is that he didn't compromise. He explained the pure market economy where government has no role at all, where there's a separation of economy in the state and money in the state, as you point out, just like we separate church and state. And he explained chapter by chapter how this works, the importance of the price system, as you point out, as a mechanism for giving people signals. When prices rise, they know to conserve. When wage rates rise, they know, hey, that's where I need to go get a job. And so you've got this intricate system in which each person is playing his role in life and coordinating with other people and bringing this results of bounty that nobody could ever come up with as a central planner or a government planner. In fact, I've pointed out before that I grew up as a liberal. I thought government should help the poor, but I finally realized, because of Mises and this concept of interventionism, as you point out, and socialism, that it's that paradigm of socialism and interventionism that destroy the poor. It keeps them poor. And that it's only this radical case for a pure free market economy that is really the key to ending poverty. It's the only way to raise people's standard of living across the board. And Mises explains how that process works. Now, human action is tough to get through, as you know. So is a theory of money and credit. I mean, I would recommend to anybody who's just learning about Ludwig von Mises to get a little book called Economic Policy, which was a series of lectures that he gave in Argentina back in the 50s. And so he knew he was talking to regular people. It still is somewhat academic, but it's very easily understandable. And anybody that reads that book will know more economics than most economics professors in this country. And then the other one is, I think it's the Crisis of Interventionism, that talks about what you were talking about how interventionism, it just produces more crises. That government creates the crisis in the first place with its initial intervention, and then to fix the crisis from that, it then starts enacting another intervention. That produces more crises, another intervention, until you have a full-fledged government takeover of that particular sector of the economy, or actually the entire economy, like we see in Cuba or North Korea. This is where socialism and intervention lead us. And so, yeah, Mises is a giant in this movement, because he really took the ideas of another giant, Adam Smith, and he explained them in a very succinct, clear way as to why the free market philosophy is really the only economic philosophy that works.
Absolutely. The thing in a great thinker is that his ideas continue to ring true beyond his own time. Mises lived and wrote a good part of his work in the first half of the 20th century, a time that in one sense is significantly different than our own. And many of the examples that he uses and the circumstances that he's discussing reflect the situation in which he lived, the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, for example, when he was writing most of his major works. But what stands out when you read him, at least in my view, is the timelessness, the timelessness of the style in which he writes. He's trying to explain what is universally true, what is always the case, what is globally applicable, to understand the circumstances of the human condition and how markets work and how the society functions that transcends whether it's the 1920s or 2017. In other words, you see the problems of your own time illustrated with the examples he uses of his circumstances, but because it's explained in terms of the underlying principles of human action, of how markets work, of how society functions through the price mechanism and competition, on the inherent and inescapable nature of when government's intervention in one way or the other, so that in fact he writes and speaks for all times and not just for his own. And that means that unlike many classics, a classic book that people may refer to but ends up sitting on the shelf and never really looked at, or one passage that's occasionally taken out, his works in general have this flavor that you can pick them up today And while the examples are often about his own time, the applicability of them is easily seen in our times and our problems, and how his arguments offer solutions for us as well.
All right. Well, let me wrap up with a little personal vignette. There was a time when I was working in New York, and I think you were visiting at the time. You were at Hillsdale, and you asked me, how would you like to go have tea at Margit Mises's house? And because you were very good friends with her, this was Ludwig von Mises's wife, who had been an actress in Austria, and of course I leaped at the opportunity. And so we go to her apartment there in Manhattan, and she, I guess, was probably around 80, 85 years old, and she graciously invites us into her apartment, and we sit in this little sitting area where most of the conversations between you and her, because y'all had been friends a long time, and I was there as a guest, mostly just enjoying the conversation. But she served little tea and cookies and stuff. And when we were finished eating and drinking the refreshments, she turned to me and said, "Jacob, would you mind doing the dishes?" And I was a little bit taken aback, but I said, "Of course not." And so I take the dishes, and I'm nervous as heck because it looked like really expensive china. And I thought, gosh, that's all I need is to break Margit Mises' china. So I'm carefully washing the dishes and drying them and putting them there on the shelf. And then as we're leaving, she pulls a copy of Mises's fantastic book, Omnipotent Government, off the shelf, brand new copy. And she opens it up, takes a pen, and inscribes to Jacob, "For a job well done, Margit Mises." And then she looks at me and she says, "But no one will ever know what the job was." So you were good friends with her. Did you ever meet Mises?
No, when he passed away in 1973, the autumn of 1973, I actually was still an undergraduate working on a bachelor's degree in economics at California State University. And so, but I did write a little obituary piece for the student school newspaper, California State University at Sacramento. But to show you the mindset of the economics profession at that time, and how Mises and Austrian economics in general had gone down George Orwell's memory hole. Shortly, I guess a day after the student newspaper had appeared with my obituary about Mises, one of my professors came up to me and dead serious said, Mises, didn't he die in the 19th century? The profession had and unfortunately to a great extent still has been taken over by so much of this mindset and approach of the presumption of the benefits of the economic planner and social engineer, and that this idea of a laissez-faire economy is a quaint notion of a simpler but bygone era, and that we now need this pervasive presence of government, resulted in Mises falling into oblivion. But I have to say is that now, several decades later, if you look around, there has been a renaissance of the Austrian School of Economics, a radical, transformative rediscovery and reappreciation for the ideas of Mises and other Austrians. Another one who I know we'll end up talking about in the series, Friedrich Hayek. So once having sort of gone to an oblivion, they have now, like Phoenix, risen from the ashes. And while it is certainly not mainstream, there is a significant and vibrant Austrian School of Economics in which the ideas of Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek are the core stimulus for further development, growth, and application.
Yeah, it truly is a testament to the power of truth. That it may not find its way during the time the person is writing, but it ultimately rises to the surface. And that's why Mises and Hayek and so many other libertarian giants and Austrian economists have been such powerful influences for you and me and other libertarians. On that note, Richard, we're out of time. I greatly enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for sharing your insights on Mises.
My pleasure. Until next time.
Yep. See y'all next time. Again, if you'd like to learn more about Austrian economics, Ludwig von Mises, check out our website at fff.org, and check out Richard's ebook on the principles of Austrian economics.
Austrian economics and public policy, restoring freedom and prosperity. Available from Amazon for the quite reasonable price of $4.99. And everything you ever wanted to know about Austrian economics, but were either willing to or afraid to ask, will be answered in its pages.
Right, and then you've got the video series, an introduction to Austrian economics, which is the best introduction you'll ever watch for Austrian economics at the quite reasonable price, even better than the book, of free. And that's on our website at fff.org. Richard, until next week.
Till next week. Bye-bye.